This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On November 7th, our Defence and Security Studies program welcomed the Honourable Bill Graham back to the RCMI for a wide-ranging conversation on Canada's defence stance following the Defence Policy Review announced in June 2017. Canadian foreign ministers, including the sitting one. And with that, welcome back, Bill.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dan Eustace, and I'm the Director of the Defense and Security Studies program here at the RCMI. And it is my honor and pleasure to be Bill's interrogator this evening. Actually, my job is to ask him hopefully the easy questions, and we'll do so for about 45 minutes or so. Bill can either ignore my questions or answer them and go off in any direction he so wishes. But the
it's not going to be like questions here.
No, it's not. No, not at all.
We all said this questions here. Not answers.
That's right. We don't really expect answers per se. We just expect thoughts. But then the floor will be open to you to ask the tough questions. And Bill has agreed to take those for a period of time. So that's great. So first of all, may I echo what Eric just said about your award recently of the Vimy Award. That's fabulous. You've joined now a long list of people who have made very, very significant contributions to Canadian defense and security. So if I may not steal our president's thunder, Mike Hoare, but on behalf of the RCMI and everybody here gathered, well done and congratulations on that award. That's very significant. So I think the thing that I'm initially interested in, and by the way, thank you very much for sharing your speech that you gave at the Vimy Award. That was very helpful to me to understand some of your ideas. But I think it's your recent role, and this is something that Eric did not mention, is that you were one of the 4 distinguished Canadians to act as the Minister of Defence's advisory panel or committee on the recently published Defense Policy Review. Which is a very significant document, this wouldn't be a surprise to you. I don't think that you would have been asked to be part of that panel. But I'm interested in a couple of questions, if I may. The first is that one of the statements that was made in the introductory letter is that you all 4 members of the panel were thoroughly briefed on strategic challenges that are facing Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces. And I'm wondering if you might be interested in elaborating a little bit on what were some of those strategic challenges that caught your attention and that you think we ought to be thinking about here at the Royal Canadian Military Institute.
But this is that's a really that is a very good question, and I'll have to think a little bit about going back on what we did get some briefing. But let me say that one of the things that we said, and which was commented on by a lot of people, was that this defense review was a little bit different in that it wasn't part of a general foreign policy review. And as I so often used to say with John McCallum, defense is to some extent derivative of foreign policy, but foreign policy is dependent on defense. So there's a relationship there. And in this case, the review was articulated without that foreign policy statement. And the government's answer, and I think I came around to accepting it, although I would say Louise and Arbour and myself were a little maybe more skeptical than others, was that the foreign policy concepts of the government have been pretty well laid out in the mission statements of the ministers and in various other policy documents of the government. And insofar as defense was concerned, it was, I think, pretty clear that in the Liberal Party platform, if you look at it during the election, they didn't talk a lot about defense. And we should come back to that. I mean, this organization is amazing. We talk about defense and security issue here, but the average Canadian public doesn't talk about defense and security at all. I mean, Jack Cunningham's here. I mean, we teach together a course at the University of Toronto on defense and security. I think, Jack, it's the only course at the University of Toronto, apart from one other you teach on nuclear, on defense in the whole of the University of Toronto. I mean, this is astonishing, really. We don't have a lively debate about security. So that was to some extent absent, but I think that was laid out. So the Liberal Party's platform really didn't talk about defense, but it did articulate a vision of a more active Canada, at least in respect of supporting United Nations peacekeeping operations. And I say peacekeeping in a rather disingenuous use of the term, because it's no longer peacekeeping as we well know. But they did say that we would be more active in that. So that was certainly there as guidance for those who were drafting the paper. But I just want to leave you with something about that. I mean, I came away, when we did the 2005 Defense Review, which really, in many ways, if you like, as minister, I really persuaded the Prime Minister to hire Rick Hillier, because Rick had an articulate vision of both the challenges of the forces. He brought with him the experience of Bosnia and the experiences these young officers had in the field that a lot of other people hadn't had. He knew what failed and failing states were about, and he knew the dangers, and he knew how to describe. So he was able to create a defense policy that was sensible. This policy was much more a collaborative effort between the civilian side, Gordon Venner, the deputy minister, and General Vance and his people. And I have to say, they were really a remarkable team, quite apart from the actual vision itself.
Did that in a sense surprise you? Did that surprise you at all in some respects?
Well, I guess I have to be a little bit careful about how I say this, but yes, it did surprise me. I don't mean to.
I didn't mean that in a derogatory sense of anyone previously.
I don't mean to denigrate previous things, but I mean, I was a politician in Ottawa, okay? And so in politics and in the cabinet, Eileen Carroll, who's here, was my colleague in the cabinet. She can speak for this as well. Defense did not have a high reputation for being able to either articulate its vision and, perhaps more importantly, the kit that it needed to achieve that vision. And the biggest problem, at least that I had when I was minister, was that finance had absolutely no faith in the ability of the Defense Department to either buy or equip itself in the way in which they thought it was appropriate. Now, there's two elements to that. One of the elements was there were some problems on procurement, and there's always problems with procurement. We can talk about that. But the other problem is that I don't think the defense establishment never really came to grips with the fiscal challenges that a government has. And so, you know, you can say, well, we've got this huge problem. We need chips. But, like, we also need health care, and we need this, and we need that. And when you get to the overall budget and the fiscal realities of the country, you've got to be able to really get in there and fight for your vision. I'll tell you just a little story about the review as we were doing it on that. One of the problems is the system, the accounting system. We went in one day to a meeting, and Admiral Norman was there as head of the Navy, And I said to him, I said, I see here in the budget that the surface vessels are in the budget for $19 billion. And so I said, that looks a little low to me. Oh, he said, it's probably going to be 60 billion, Minister. So I said, this is going to be a bit of a ticker shock for the politicians. And sure enough, I talked to my friend Scott Bryson. I said, Scott, when it got to him, he was head of the Treasury Board. And they sort of thought that this was son of a thing that the Defense Department had cooked up to kind of sandbag the politicians. And I said, no, this is just an inefficiency in the system. It was bad accounting. It never should have been put in at 19 billion in the first place, but that's what they did. And so there's a whole system in there that's really problematic and creates huge political problems that the average person has no appreciation. But I mean, Scott was quite mad. He said to me, he said, these guys are trying to get us. This is this is some sort of Harper plot to turn 19 billion into 60 billion, and it's going to make us look like chums. I said, it's got nothing to do with that. And so there's a credibility issue. And I will say that coming back to this particular document, Dan, I have to say, Secure, Engaged, and it is a document that overcame that credibility gap. It was fabulously professional in the way in which it was presented. The quality of the analysis and the quality of the underlying mathematics and some of the flow charts that, took up to other departments, and they looked at them and said, whoa, these guys really know what they're talking about. That's how you get money in Ottawa. You gotta blow the other people out of the water.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's certainly one of the most detailed documents of its type. Mm-hmm. I had a master's student last year who did his thesis on previous defense policies and these sorts of papers and looking at similarities and differences and trends and so on. And this one I think stands out as being one of the ones that really has provided a lot of detail that the others didn't. And if you'll permit me, I'd like to ask you about a specific aspect of detail that's included.
May I just make a quick point?
Of course, yeah.
Because the detail I'm talking about isn't so much the detail in the document itself.
I understand.
It was the detail of the presentation
of the process.
They were able to go. So when the minister went to cabinet, he said, those aircraft, are going to be phased out at such and such a time. We were always talking about, we're still flying those helicopters. What are they, the
Sea Kings?
We're still flying.
Well, they're older than all the pilots are, that's for sure.
Scott Bryson and I went down in 2005. We flew down to Halifax and said, well, we got $5 billion for new helicopters. We won't need the Sea Kings anymore. We're still flying Sea Kings. This is...
I hope you didn't take a trip this time, did you?
I was lucky enough never to have to put foot in a Sea King.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you a question actually about an aspect of detail in the actual report, if you don't mind, because you brought this up, and of course it has to do with this point you've raised, which is the whole business of defense spending, and NATO has this target, and I know we have an expert from NATO here. There's right there, Julie Lindhout is an expert. And NATO has this stated view that NATO countries should be contributing, quote, 2% of their gross domestic product on defense spending. But within this particular review, the total forecasted defense spending under the policy was expected to reach 1.4% of GDP by 2024 and 25.
We're below 1% at the moment.
Below 1%. And even this amount was, to some extent, the result of some, quote, accounting changes in terms of what was going to be included in the defense budget.
Right.
But nevertheless, even if we were to hit that 1.4%, it would still be below that 2% goal. So I guess my question is, were you, in a sense, satisfied with that outcome? But I guess at the same time, in your view, are these spending targets relevant to the overall process? And in terms of capital equipment, for example, was there a specific discussion or were you interested in sort of the priorities of what kinds of capital equipment would be, in fact, procured over the course of this whole defense policy review timeframe?
Yeah, I think there are two questions in there. One is capital question, what's the right balance in terms of the budget, and the other is the 2%. So taking the 2% first. I've never liked these numbers. Now I have to be careful because Eileen, she was the CETA minister, so she liked the 0.1%, for foreign aid, which I thought was seriously goofy number because the GDP goes up and suddenly you're out of whack, and so the 2%. I mean, the GDP goes up and suddenly the GDP. So we have a recession, GDP comes down, and suddenly, and as Lord Robertson used to say about Canada, to us when we were talking about these things, he used to say, Canada's a bit low on its inputs, but it's very big on its outputs. I think you have to look at the outputs. I mean, the Germans have a huge military force, but it's not very efficient and not very deployable. But I don't know how close they are. They're a lot closer to 2% than we are, but they're not deployable. So deployability and interoperability is as important, in my view, as the 2%. However, we signed on to the 2% number, so we put up our hand and voted for it, so we're kind of stuck with it. But if it were up to me, I'd say this is a goofy thing. I don't understand that. But that does take us back to your point about the capital budget. Now, there are business people in this room, and every businessman knows that if you don't have enough invested in the capital of your business, you're basically going to rust out. And we are presently at 17% of the budget of the Defense Department, DND, is for capital. This in an era of cyber, automatic weapons, complicated new machinery, missiles, in other words, highly intensive, expensive, capital expensive items. And we're at 17%. When we talked to the Australians who came and talked to us, I said, what do you guys do on this? They said, we figure we've got to get to 25% if we're going to be relevant. So every meeting I went to with our group, I would say, what's our capital? What's the percentage? And the answer always I got, and to some extent it was a legitimate answer, because it was kind of fair, it said, well, stop complaining about the general number, because when we start building the surface vessels, it'll go up. And then it'll go down. If we buy the super expensive planes, it'll go up. So it does go in cycles. I accept that. But I do think that I wish that this report had articulated and said, if we aren't at 22% capital, we're rusting out and we're becoming irrelevant. But they weren't willing to do that. And that was one of my disappointments about the report.
And what do you think that is based on? Is that more of a political question, or do you think that's purely a matter of government finances?
Well, I think it was a matter of them saying, well, the problem is we could be 22% one year and 25% another year and 20% the next year because of the fluctuations. But I still think maybe if you chose something, there should be some sort of a trend. I mean, take cyber alone. Now, the problem with cyber, of course, is a black hole. It could eat up, every dollar we have, and you still wouldn't solve the problem. So there are some of these items that are big, but I do think the capital budget is interesting. I will say one thing. I'm doing some interesting work at the moment with the special forces, and it's quite interesting to talk to them because they are small and agile, and they're able to get, because they're on the front line and kind of doing a lot of sexy stuff, they can get money for operations, and they can get it, even though it's quite expensive from that perspective. But talking to General Vance, I said, how come these guys can get it? And he said, well, they're a small group, so we make a decision to give them that. That's a $5 million decision. If we said the whole kit, the whole group, everybody had to get it, that would be a $300 million decision. So that taught me something. Maybe we should be focusing more on smaller groups and enabling them to to be properly equipped. But that's another discussion.
So in terms of your recent work with the Defense Policy Review, compared to what you had worked on back in the day, 2005, I mean, what did you see that was the same? What did you see that was different between those two eras?
Well, what was different? I don't think the threat assessment was significantly different. I think there was the traditional debate, do we want to be more niche focused or general purpose? The report comes down more on the general purpose side, which I think was inevitable. It was funny, when I was foreign minister, I used to often meet with Colin Powell, and we'd be sitting having drinks down in the Caribbean or somewhere, and he'd say, you guys in Canada, you're crazy, you should be more niche focused, and you can't be too sassy mood for everything. And so I'd say, yeah, well, that's great for you to say that, but you're basically saying you'd like us to do the niches that you don't want to do. And so, yeah, what if we wanted to do niches you didn't like? Well, no, there's your niche. And
if they change their mind, we're in trouble, right?
Exactly. So, there was the whole, so you got into these sort of discussions. But I think, a country like Canada can't be that niche focused. We got 3 oceans. You can't, so we're going to say, what are we going to do with the Navy? There's certain realities. There was one threat assessment where I had some disagreement, and it's a public thing, so I'm not hiding anything. But I think the threat assessment from North Korea, and I hardly need to tell anybody that, given if you're watching the news today, is that I really think we should be revisiting the ballistic missile defense issue, and I advocated that at the Senate and committee, and the Senate committee agreed. It was bipartisan support. So I think the government is looking at it. For those of you who want to talk about the politics of it, I think politics is so crazy. When I was there, I was the advocate for missile defense, and Martin made me the advocate, and George Bush made it impossible for us to do it by invading Iraq and creating a condition where Canadians didn't want to cozy up to George Bush. Harper could have done missile defense with Obama any day. All he had to do was say to Canadians, Mr. Obama wants us to do it. Everybody said, hey, we love Obama, let's do it. He didn't do it. Now we've got Trump, we're back to Bush. We can't do it. It's politically unattractive. So this is politics, but this is also defense. And defense is determined, these issues are determined by politics. That said, I think apart from that threat assessment, that one threat assessment, I think, is something we're going to have to focus on for sure. Because it's not just North Korea. There's going to be some rogue state or some rogue element of some kind that are going to get, I don't say ballistic missiles, but our troops are already fighting ISIS that have use of drones. They're already having to shoot down drones, and they're having a lot of trouble figuring how to deal with them. So we're going to have to deal with this sort of issue for sure.
Okay. All right. Thank you. One of the things I found interesting about the DPR was that it actually sort of led off with some discussions and issues around people and the members of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Right.
And so I'm wondering whether or not you engaged in discussions about such issues as recruitment and retention, and the way in which the younger people, younger members of Canadian society have changed. I think they're often referred to as millennials, and they have a different upbringing. They have a different relationship with technology and how they learn. And this is, I think, creating some challenges around how the Canadian Forces can recruit people and retain them. And at the same time, I think there are also issues that have been openly discussed about our ability to recruit, for example, visible minorities, Indigenous people, women, and all of this is causing a lot of challenges, I think, to the Canadian Armed Forces going forward. How do we continue to recruit people, and in the context both of what's happening in society as as far as the millennial piece is concerned, but also the targets that the government is setting and the Canadian Armed Forces are setting for themselves to ensure that they're more representative of Canadian society as a whole. I'm just wondering whether any of that sort of discussion came up and what some of your own personal views would be on that subject.
Well, we had a lot of discussions around that. That was very interesting. There was a lot of energy went into discussing those issues. And there was a lot of controversial discussion around why would the Defense Review itself start on the issue of people and gender-based analysis. And some of us said, this is crazy. We should have the strategic analysis and the threat analysis, and then you get to the people. And yet I came around to accepting that. So for a whole host of reasons. The first, so going back to the composition of the force itself, when we went down to the UN, if you're going to talk about being involved in these complicated missions now, where the legal and political framework within which they're conducted are very complex, and the environments in which they're conducted are really, really difficult. The fact that we have a force that is diverse, pluralistic in nature, with a lot of women in it, makes a big difference. I mean, I was very impressed, for example, we met with when we were in New York, the Indian representative to the UN pointed out that the Indians deploy a whole battalion of women on peacekeeping missions, like a battalion of women as women, not just, and they're hugely effective when they go into a village or go into an area because they can relate to the women in the village and they can actually deal with issues the men can't deal with. They're very, very effective troops. And I had Andy Leslie the other night tell me how important the women were in Afghanistan, our women, and how they could add a dimension. And as you know, as I said, gay and lesbian troops that are there are an inspiration to oppressed minorities, etc. So the diversity is something I'm talking about just on the operations side, which is advantageous of it. Take Minister Sajjan himself. I mean, the reason he was big success in Afghanistan was he went and did things for the Americans that were incredible. And it was because he was a Sikh and he could go out and do things that they couldn't do, and they really appreciated it. And we've got a lot of street cred in Washington today thanks to this guy who, with his turban, went out and was able to go and be part of that community and be different from other people. So from the very need of the structure of the force, it has to be there. And what does it need? It needs now, going back to our special forces, needs cyber experts, nuclear experts. I mean, so where are you going to get these from? And in the traditional military way of recruiting and people, I forget what the term is for, complete mission ability and everything. We're going to have to be more flexible about the way in which we recruit and retain people. The reserves are a big part of that, a huge part of that. And I was really glad to see in the review, they said, okay, the reserves can really be focused on providing some niche capabilities here that the regular forces don't have. But the fact of the matter is, we now need a set of skills that are different. And then I come back to our millennial thing. That's the one thing I remember sitting and saying to General Vance one day. I said, General, how are you going to recruit these kids? I mean, I've just been up at the law school and they don't behave like law students did when I was a law student. They don't say, "Hey, sir, may I ask a question, please?" This is a different generation. We're not going to recruit them and have them behave the way troops did in the past. I mean, forget it. It's not going to happen. So there's going to have to be some real changes in attitude and flexibility. And I think to some extent, the review opened the window to that. It's just a beginning of a discussion. It's going to be very difficult. And I think talking to other people around all forces are dealing with this. I think the special forces, particularly because they require some really very special capabilities, they're looking at how they can bring people in on a part-time basis. And so, but how do you do that as a military operation? You know, I'm looking at some guys here that have been commanding officers of regiments. How would you feel about it if you had a guy who was, I'm just here for 2 weeks, boss? You know, this is a tricky way to try and manage things. But I think this is what we have to look at.
No, thank you. That's going to be an issue, I think, going forward for
it's going to be a huge issue for all of us, for society. And it's not just us. I mean, it's corporations, it's society as a whole has to look at this, for sure.
Speaking of challenges, we have an interesting neighbor now to our south. And
those Mexicans are great. They're nice people.
I'm not quite thinking that far south, but I think that's also true, what you just said. But you know, you're in a unique position because you have been both the Minister of Foreign Affairs and also Minister of Defense. So I just wanted to get your take on, you know, the idea that I think was put forward by Minister Freeland in her speech to the House of Commons in June, and I can quote her if you would allow me, where she said in her speech, she said, "The fact that our friend and ally has come to question the very worth of its mantle of global leadership puts into sharper focus the need for the rest of us to set our own clear and sovereign course. For Canada, that course must be the renewal, indeed the strengthening of the post-war multilateral order." I'm thinking that, you know, these might be more than just words. I mean, depending on what happens over the next little while, there's very specific challenges. Obviously, for example, to do with the renewal of NAFTA. You mentioned ballistic missile defense, and I'm sure there's other very complex issues that we need to address with the United States. But first of all, how do you think, this is probably a loaded question, but how do you think the Liberal government's doing in its relationship with the U.S.? Do you see any actual threats on the horizon in terms of our relationship? And how would you characterize sort of the state of the multilateral liberal order as it stands today? Now, that's a question you can answer in 5,000 words or less. I'll mark your paper later on.
Right. Well, to answer the first part, of course, I think the government's doing an amazing job of handling. No, I think, wow, this is a really tricky file. And this is difficult. Let's just look at it through the lens, starting with the lens of the defense and security. So when I was foreign minister and when I was defense minister, I always said that the defense of North America, you know, we were Siamese twins with the United States. We had to have interoperability with our forces and with our equipment and everything else. But all of that was based on an assumption that we had a common vision about what we were going to do and where we were going to go. And that common vision is severely strained when you have an incident like we did with Iraq, when we said we're not going to go and we can't go. And that caused us some strains. I mean, with the Five Eyes and various other issues. We got over it, and it's not the only time we've done that. I mean, Pierre Trudeau recognized Red China. Pearson objected to Vietnam. So this is not something Canada hasn't done. We have an independent foreign policy, and when I said to Colin Powell on the phone, we're not going to Iraq, he said, well, you're a sovereign country. You'll make your own decision. And he wasn't particularly bothered by it. Other people were. But today is very different. So today we have an administration that is unreliable, volatile, changes mind, so it's hard to know where it's going. A Congress which is very difficult to read and goes in different ways. Different governors of different states and things like that. So the United States has always been complicated. Because as Alan Gottlieb said, you know, the United States is not really a country, it's a universe. And so you have to understand that it's, you know, you're dealing with much more than you would in a normal country-to-country relationship. I accept that. I mean, I accept, you know, I've got a great story I love to tell. You know, when people ask me about Canada, the U.S., I say, well, I always used to say, well, Canada's different from the U.S. And I remember I was giving a speech once in Los Angeles, and I said, Canada's quite different, than you guys. We have gun controls. We don't believe in all those guns. We've just voted in favor of same-sex marriage. You're still struggling with it. You're Supreme Court. We do this. We do that. And at the end of my speech, a little old lady got up at the back of the room. She said, "Mr. Graham, I just want to say one thing to you. There are more people in California that think like Canadians than there are in Canada." So, so it's all very well to say, Americans think one way and Canadians think another way, but it's, it's a big country and it's hugely different. Texas is not Alabama or not New England, etc. So all of this to say, there was a time where we could count on a sense of unity in the States that we can't count on now. And that's a problem for us when it comes to the defense review, because there's a set of assumptions in our defense policy that we're with the Americans on the defense of North America, and they're going to make decisions, and we're going to back them up as a team. But if the team starts to fall apart, Dan, are we as Canadians, or are we all going to say, well, we're going to spend less on health care and start spending more money on defense because we can't count on our American colleagues? That would be very interesting debate to have in this country. So I don't know where we're going. We'll see with NAFTA. I've just come from a meeting of the Trilateral Commission on the weekend, and our Mexican colleagues, for example, are in a worse position in many ways than we are, because as they pointed out, for us, NAFTA is a trade agreement. But for them, it was an agreement about establishing certain social policies of Mexico and the rule of law and a whole set of parameters, social parameters, that if it falls apart, may not be there. And if Obrador gets elected with their own kind of Trump, they'll be in some really very difficult social turmoil and problems. Not that they don't already have some. So that's. So going back to your question is, how are we handling this? I think we're handling it the best we can. I don't think anybody who was in government would do it, frankly, any differently. It's almost on a day-to-day basis. You have to kind of grab it. I do think we're lucky. I think Chrystia Freeland is a really super competent, intelligent person who knows the United States very well and has a lot of contacts there. I know that Andy Leslie, her parliamentary secretary, knows every general in the administration. I know he talks to John Kelly regularly because they're personal friends. I know that he talks to many of those Mattas and others because they've all been in Afghanistan together. I know that Minister Sajjan has the same sort of level of relationship. So we've got some deep personal relationships in the administration. We've got some deep personal relationships in the Congress, and we just have to keep working them. Andy told me he'd been to see practically every governor in the state in the states in the last few months. Kathleen Wynn's been down to see 12 governors recently to say we've got to do this. So we've got the premiers are all going down there. Everybody's doing it, and to see the U.S. Chamber of Commerce say, don't screw up NAFTA. We're building the support, but as I say, how can you understand or deal with a country where you wake up in the morning and a tweet may say, I've decided to attack North Korea? I was literally sat at the meeting with the head of Boeing on Saturday, and he said, I'm worried that tonight the North Koreans will send a missile and they may decide to attack tomorrow. This is nuclear war. So how do you deal with that?
How do you deal with that?
Yeah.
I have many questions, but I'm not going to hog the time. What I'd like to do is open it up to the floor. So I will invite people to speak and recognize who has questions. And the idea is to speak up and project your voice. Let me know when you're ready, Eric.
All set.
Okay. Matthew Gazenbeek.
Bill, how would you, let's assume that the NATO, a lot of the NAFTA negotiations failed. What would we do in regard to procurement? Would we still work on procurement from the Americans, or would we use what Friedland said, that we'll go somewhere else? Could you comment on that? And the second one that I'd like to, you have your comments on, you mentioned that you met with the Boeing people, and I think that is a saga in competence on some part of some people. There's going to be every business case in every MBA school in Canada.
Right.
Could you comment on?
I'm sorry, which will be a business case in every...
The Boeing.
So,
Boeing.
No, they could have made that deal with our Canadian company,
Right.
rather than us having to go to Airbus. I mean, that deal was there for them to take. How could they screw up so badly? And are we still going to be buying equipment from Boeing if they really, stay with that attitude they've had? Well, there are two questions.
The Boeing question totally drove the first question out of my mind because it's kind of so complicated. But I think the first question was, if NAFTA goes, what do we do about military procurement? I mean, NAFTA really is about tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers being reduced. Military procurement in this country, and Professor Dorn's here, so they're going to be better experts than I am in this, but military procurement, as I've understood it, goes back to the Ogdensburg Agreement, where we agreed we would have a military relationship with the United States where we could get procurement with one another. So I honestly don't see the NAFTA failure stopping the interrelationships between the firms. I mean, I was talking to the head of Boeing, or the head of international Boeing at the Trilateral, and he pointed out that Boeing itself has huge investments in Winnipeg and in Quebec and in Toronto, and these are not going to go away. And the McDonnell Douglas people that are manufacturing the wheeled vehicles that have been sold to Saudi Arabia with such controversy, I mean, that is, I don't think any of that will go away. I think the problem has been, as I understand it, that in the last few years, because of the extraordinary high-tech nature of a lot of military procurement, there has been secrecy rules in the United States that don't allow them to share the way they used to, so that the old kind of deal that we were, Canada and the U.S. were one single market in military procurement, is more of a historic myth than it is a present day reality, which is a concern for a lot of defense production people. So I'm not sure that it's tied to NAFTA, but certainly the NAFTA's demise would not help that. But I've been at the Pentagon. We've talked to the Americans about procurement. All I can say also about that is that this present government is much more transactional focused, and so it's going to say, fine, if we give you this, we want that, and things like that. That would be, for example, my concern about ballistic missile defense. When I was interested in ballistic missile defense, the Americans didn't want anything from us if we did it. Today, if I want to be part of ballistic missile defense, the present government is probably going to say, well, if you want something, we're going to get something back from you. We're going to insist on you giving us something. I don't know what that would be, but that seems to be the mindset that we have to deal with.
Friedland made a reference to that if NAFTA would fail, that she would think in terms of having the Europeans or whatever. Sometimes
Wow, we've always, I mean, remember Trudeau and the troisième option? I mean, we always have talked about the attempts to do that. I think in defense procurement, that might be, there's a huge integration factor that takes place that I think that's far more in depth than I even know or understand, but it's pretty deep. It doesn't stop us from buying equipment from somewhere else, but the Americans and ourselves are bound to be the partners. The problem I see with present dealing with the United States is that because of this, of the secrecy issue around a lot of these things, they want us to put plants in the States so they can control. So I know of an extremely effective rifle that was developed in the United States, rather in Quebec, for sniper purposes. And the U.S. said, yeah, we'll buy it, but you're going to have to manufacture it in Alabama where we can control the technology around it and things like that. So the Quebec manufacturer actually moved the operations down there. And I can think of a very important scientific development in Canada that I've always told them, keep the operations here, because if you move it to the States, there's no reason why NASA or somebody wouldn't just take it over there in the way in which their system operates. But that's maybe getting a little too deep in the weeds. Yeah.
About the Boeing, why didn't Boeing make a deal with Airbus?
I don't know. I can't speak for Boeing. I don't know why I did speak to, on the weekend, to some Boeing people, and their argument is that those planes are so subsidized from Bombardier that they're virtually being given away, and that while we say that they are not, they don't make a competitive product, his answer was they do. They've got a plane that's only makes 7 seats different from the C series or whatever it's called, and that in his view, when they talked to Delta said, well, we just as soon buy yours, but how could we possibly when we can buy this one for half the price? So they've got an argument that whether it's meritorious, I don't know. I mean, I'm not enough of an expert, but that's their argument. But that's not to say that Boeing doesn't manufacture a lot in this country. And it's involved in this country as well. I think maybe we want to tone the rhetoric down a little bit and have a little bit more light and a little less heat in the discussion. Maybe we can come to sort of arrangement. I kind of was quite taken by the piece by Andrew Coyne, or one of the commentators, who pointed out that the consequence of this has been Bombardier virtually is going to be subsumed by Airbus. And then you're going to have Boeing and Airbus, and Embraer is kind of left out there, and it's going to have to be subsumed by somebody. And so you're only going to have 2 manufacturers left in the world that are going to be going toe to toe. And anybody who doesn't think they're going to get huge subsidies from either the Europeans on one side or the Americans on the other is crazy. So, but this is out of my league.
Eric?
Bill, back in the five ministers panel on Thursday, the question came up of to what extent does public opinion actually influence foreign policy of defense decisions? And Kim Nossel has made it fairly clear that he thinks that, at least on the procurement side, the government sees no downside in decision-making politically. But what I wanted to get to, and I'm going to try and stick to it, is the casualties issue. We took horrendous casualties in World War I. We took casualties anywhere from 150 to 200 a day in northwestern Europe. We took 158 casualties in 10 years in Afghanistan. And do you think this is one of the things that is impeding a decision on peacemaking? The government has finally realized that we could lose 200 soldiers in a day as the Marines did in Beirut.
I don't know enough about their planning, but I don't think there's any mission that I can think of that's being looked at, and the only two that I've heard seriously talked about have been either Mali or Congo, or not Congo, but the African Republic. I don't think there's any way that you could be looking at casualties of that level, but you could certainly be looking at casualties. And no government is anxious to have casualties for sure. I do think that I think the gradually increase in the number of casualties in Afghanistan wore down the Canadian public's support for that mission. Partly because we didn't understand exactly why we were there doing this and paying for these casualties. I mean, in World War II, people put up with the casualties because it was pretty clear why we were there and what we were doing. Afghanistan, it was never entirely clear why or what we were doing. And to be paying those casualties wasn't acceptable. So I think I'd go back and saying it would be the government's job that if we're going to go into a mission where there are going to be casualties, to persuade the Canadian people that this is something that Canada should be engaged in, and that it's something that's in Canada's vital interest to be a part of. And that is the public opinion dimension. Now, I don't think that I agree with you that public opinion doesn't influence a lot of decisions around defense, like are we going to buy ships or submarines or things like that. There's not a lot of public opinion about that, except for in groups like we're in this evening. But the decision not to go into Iraq was pretty clear where public opinion was. So we knew that Canadians thought this was a damn stupid idea. And so that certainly helped the government's decision, in spite of a lot of the opinion of people that thought we should do it. So public opinion has its effect, for sure.
Walter?
Bill, you knew I would be asking a question about UN peace operations. I'd like to know, in your experience as a foreign minister and defense minister, what was it that brought our contribution down so low? I mean, the last time we sent units was in Ethiopia, Eritrea in 2001, and then there was no more support, which is not what the Canadian historical record has been. And I believe that you're the minister who agreed to withdraw us from the Golan Heights and brought us down to only 50 troops at that time. And I'm always wondering, what was the politics? Because on the public support side, there is such support for it. It's the number
For
one.
sure, for sure. Well, I mean, some of it is technical, and some of it is geopolitical, if you like, or big politics. So on the technical side, your Golan Heights is a good example. I think we've been there for 12 years or something. Yeah. So how many years?
32.
Yeah, 32 years. So like, hello, it was time for somebody else to go to the Golan Heights. 32 years is 32 years. I mean, that was the problem. That was my objection about Afghanistan, and my constant, not fury, but my frustration with NATO was that I think Canadians would have accepted the Afghan mission more if it had been the way those of us who we originally conceived of it was that we would go in for 2 years, we'd be relieved by somebody else, we would have been relieved for 2 years, 4 years, regroup, go back in. Instead of being there 10 years, drained all the time, if you'd been there on a rotation basis, people can deal with that. So I think with some of the UN missions, there was a sense that like we can't just be forever in the same place. So then why less blue hat, if you like, or blue beret, and more combat? Well, to some point, it was capacity. Once we were committed in Afghanistan, we didn't have the capacity then to go off, and we really didn't have the capacity to do a UN mission. We couldn't possibly. We were stretched thin, as you know. So then you'd say to me, well, that was a bad thing. But Walter, my answer would be, I saw the mission in Afghanistan as a United Nations mission. It was authorized by the Security Council. It was NATO delivered, but it was a Security Council mission, and it was the Bonn agreements that everybody came together and said we had to stabilize Afghanistan. When I went around making speeches at the time when I was minister, I said, this isn't peacekeeping, but this is a United Nations mission. Don't say that we're no longer doing UN work. We are doing UN work. This is the most important thing the UN's agreed to do at the moment, is to create stability in Afghanistan. Now, you might argue that was the wrong mission, and what the hell were we doing in Kandahar, and everybody in the room here is going to have their own opinion, whether we should have been there, whether we should have stayed, all sorts of those things. But I think from an international legal point of view, it was a UN mission, and for me, I thought, this is where we had to be, and this is where we had to commit. At the time, I'll tell you, the debate in Ottawa, and it was certainly in Mr. Martin's office, because Mr. Martin would say to me, Bill, if we commit to Afghanistan at this level, will we be able to go to Darfur? Because there was your peacekeeping mission of the traditional sense. And what's his name from British University of British Columbia? So Michael Byers. So he came to Ottawa and made a big speech. What the hell are we doing in Afghanistan? That's outrageous. We all should be in Darfur. I said to Michael, I've talked to the African nations. They do not want us in Darfur. We have no way to get there. It's in the middle of a desert. We don't have the helicopters. We drop in 2,500 troops. They could all be slaughtered tomorrow, and nobody would know what happened to them. It would have been like something out of King Solomon's mines, and the government would look like they were insane, and the Canadian public would say, what are you doing? I mean, you're killing our troops for nothing, for something that was unacceptable. Darfur was not a realistic mission. But there were lots of voices like Michael Byers and others saying we should be doing Darfur instead of Afghanistan. I don't accept that. I said Afghanistan was a much more justifiable mission than Darfur. And Darfur would not have been right for us at that time. So, but that was a debate. Maybe some people in the room would totally disagree with me, but
Do you feel still the same way about Afghanistan as you did?
Oh, I know, I'm so sure. I feel so sanguine about Afghanistan, but last night I went to a lecture by Margaret, thank you, by Margaret Macmillan about Kim. And she was talking about India and of course the Khyber Pass and the Great Game and everything else. And I sort of sat there thinking, oh my God, Canada, we were just part of the Great Game. You know, it was all part of the same geopolitical craziness of that region. And, you know, so and I do say this to some extent in my book. With my defense minister's hat on, planning to go to Afghanistan, it was a NATO mission. It was authorized by the Security Council. It was NATO that asked us to participate in it as a Security Council. The Bonn Accords had agreed that we should create stability in Afghanistan. From that perspective, it made sense. If I'd stepped back and put on my foreign minister's hat of some years earlier and said, we're going to an area, Pakistan and Musharraf, because I had many conversations with General Musharraf, President Musharraf, about this. And I'd say, well, what are you guys doing to, protect the border? And he'd say, oh, there is no border. It's the Durand line. It's not really a border. The Pashtuns, we're all just going back and forth. The British never controlled the northwest frontier. And if you sat and talked to him for an hour or two, you'd have said, what the hell are we doing there? So with the foreign minister's hat on, you might have said, why? But with the defense minister's hat on, and also foreign minister, from a NATO and a foreign policy point of view of Canada and its participation in NATO and the UN, it made sense. But from an understanding of the complexities of the tribal situation in Afghanistan itself. But I mean, look at the Americans that are there trying to deal with that today, and the Pashtuns, and I went to a conference, trilateral, and Kissinger and others were debating it. This is when before Holbrooke died, and he was talking about maybe they should create a Pashtunistan, a northern Afghanistan that was totally independent and different, and you could defend that. And then going back to Iraq, of course, maybe you could have different areas of Iraq which could be controlled because some are Sunni and some are Shia. And here we are. What are we doing? What are we doing in that part of the world? I mean, but this is the imperial situation, isn't it? You get yourself into local complexities about which you don't really have the depth of knowledge or understanding that would give you the right understanding about how to manage that situation. So if we do another mission in Africa or somewhere, I don't fault the government for taking its time to make sure that we're going to do it and do it right and understand the conditions we're getting into before we go.
Yes, please.
This is a complete change of pace from the British Empire.
Yes. Yes. I got carried away by Kim there.
Yes. Back to the defense
the Horse Guards were not in Afghanistan. Well, they were in Afghanistan. The Horse Guards were in Afghanistan for sure.
Yes. And as you referred to, former commanding officer in the reserves, I'm interested in the defense review and its relationship to deployment. You touched on briefly the change of the recruiting pool for the regular force, the change in profiles. I think in Afghanistan we proved the reserves have a value for augmentation in particular, and that seems to be the way forward. Recently we've seen a change in Army policy where we can recruit on our own, and that solves a major problem. Our three problems in reserves: recruitment and courses and equipment. And we've got the first two underway, and equipment is to come. To my question, what consideration did the Defense Review have to the deployment and the new reliance on a healthy reserves?
Well, I mean, I can't speak to the details that I'd like to be able to because I didn't write the review, but as I recall the section on the reserves, the first was it recognized that we would increase the size of the reserves. So there was a recognition of the validity of reserves. And as I recall, just looking at the panel on the side of the page, it said that reserves could be dedicated to certain specific tasks, which I forget, but there were a couple of specific tasks were mentioned. And then there was a recognition that the reserves themselves could be a tremendous source for diversity and for specialization like cyber and other talents that wouldn't be maybe available in the regular forces. So there was a real recognition of the need for the reserves. My own view, David, is that, what I learned when I was defense minister I used to go down the line when I was inspecting the troops in Afghanistan or Bosnia or wherever it was. I'd say, well, where are you from? And it was 25%, somewhere around 25% were always reservists. So the regular forces could not deploy to those areas without. So if we got a major deployment again, we probably would have to have reserves. But you know, it takes, what is it, 16 months to train up the reserve for the mission. So you've got the train up period and those various things. I don't think we're likely to see that type of mission in the near future. We're far more likely to see special forces being used as they're being used in Iraq at the moment. So there may well be a greater reliance on the reserves for these specializations that the regular forces don't have within them. And that'll be language skills because of diversity, cyber, and to some extent specialization. I think that's where they're going to find out where they have the reserves. But I'm not sure they have that piece entirely figured out yet. But they're committed to it. I mean, certainly I talked to General Vance on Friday night at dinner. I was sitting beside him. I said, well, about the reserves, he said, we've got to figure out. So the regular, they're committed. But like a lot of these pieces, it's a bit of a moving target. I'm not that unhappy about the reserve thing. But I do, as I say, I mean, it was a numbers game before. You couldn't deploy. We couldn't deploy Afghanistan without 25% reserves. So you didn't have to ask the question. Now, if you're going to have these other different types of deployments, you're going to be saying, well, what utility will the reserves be in those deployments? And that's going to be a more of a niche capacity that one's going to have to figure out. A niche capability, it seems to me.
One final question, and then if Bill is amenable, he might be willing to take more questions at the bar downstairs, or we'll see how he feels.
You can always handle questions at the bar.
Yes. One last question. Julie Linhout, please.
Depends who's paying. I mean, if Matthew's going to pay it.
Well, he'll pay for it, don't worry.
I could comment on and ask questions about a whole lot of things, but one of the things that struck me, Bill, you said that people would wonder if they could take part-time specialist people. But I remember it wasn't all that long ago when one of the commanding officers of a regiment said, I never expected to have a lawyer with me on every operation, and that they would be rotated through because the legal issues in warfare today are so important. And no ship leaves port without a legal officer on board to advise about the legal issues. So it seems to me that just as the armed forces got used to having a legal opinion or somebody on board who would provide that, they would get used to having somebody with them who would provide a particular niche advice that they would need at a particular moment. And that the reserves would probably be the best source for that, the best place to work that up. Just as right now, I know that at NORAD, pretty much all of the personnel comes from the National Guard as opposed to the regular, simply because there's so much to be invested in their training and the things that they have to do. A normal, say, 3-year rotation through Air Force would just simply just be too upsetting for that kind of thing. And so they use the National Force, and they can keep the National Guard, and they can keep them for 9 years and really develop a very high level. Because the thing is that with the high level of competence, you also have to pay a lot more than your ordinary average person. So that also has to become something acceptable, unless you're prepared to train them. But if you go in and find them where they are in civilian life and use their expertise when you need them, but you have to pay for that. So I think those are some of the interesting things. I thought it was interesting too that you commented on Lord Robertson's comment about the outputs as opposed to the inputs, because that is still the attitude at NATO. You hear it when you go and talk to people and you hear them make those statements about it, one of the reasons why Canada stayed so long in Afghanistan, according to one of my former colleagues from Denmark, was because Canada was the only country, in addition to the big one, US, UK, that could mount the kinds of expertise and flexibility and ability and capability that we showed in Afghanistan in sufficient numbers to make a difference. And so they kept asking for the Canadians not to leave because they were so crucial. And for all those reasons that you said, the kinds of flexibility, the kinds of things that people can do, and that Canadian soldiers can do.
I think you've made a couple of really good points. And I'll pick up on a couple of them. One of them that I learned, and I really hadn't appreciated until I got involved in this particular review exercise, was that the qualifications of our NCOs is higher than in other forces. The Americans, for example, a sergeant will be rotated through in a year and a half or whatever it is. You take our good sergeants and master corporals, they're given responsibility that only officers take in the U.S. forces and the British forces. We're talking to other forces, the quality, the level of the training and the capacity of leadership of our NGOs is really remarkable. I think this is particularly true in something like the Special Forces. The Special Forces under General Rouleau have been quite flattened. I mean, he's very much, and he'll say to the Master Corporal, I speak to the chief speaks to the Prime Minister, and I speak to you, and you're three steps from the Prime Minister sort of thing. This is not a normal military trajectory. It's largely because of the capacity of these particular, I think that's an unusual, it's a feature of the Canadian, I don't know whether it's the Navy as well, but it's certainly true of the Army, and I don't know about the Air Force. So I think that's one feature of this specialization that we're able to get. But I think, going back to your point, Julie, is that I think the problem they're going to have now is that the areas of specialization are so tricky that you're not going to have general purpose people that are going to be able to deal with them. When I talk about cyber, nuclear, chemical, biological, I mean, the Special Forces have, and as anybody knows anything about Suffield, Canada has one of the most remarkable places in the world. The American Presidential Guard train at Suffield because they cannot use live agents in the United States, and they can use them. And they have to come to Canada to understand some of the problems they have to deal with in protecting the President of the United States. So we have a specialty and special services that nobody really knows much about or pays much attention to, but they actually were in Mosul. They actually went in. There were chemical weapons there. There were biological weapons. There was even the odd threat of a nuclear thing. These guys are able to go in and do, but they can't all be that. They have to be supplemented by scientists and others that are not going to join the forces and jump out of airplanes and be paratroopers. They're just going to come in on a specialized basis. So we're going to have to really figure out how to make our armed forces adaptable in that way. And everybody's trying to do this. The Brits, the Americans, French, everybody's trying to come to grips with that. But I will say that one thing that makes our forces, in my experience, different from the others is that the quality of training and leadership capacity and experience of our non-commissioned officers is, I don't like to say superior to, but, well, I will say superior to that of other armed forces.
Well, that's what I hear on a regular basis
Yeah.
when I talk to people who have experience from other countries and
Yeah.
who have experience with our troops, that they are extremely resourceful. And I think part of that, too, is the leadership that every person in the Canadian Armed Forces basically is informed what the particular goal is. It isn't that it's only told to the officers and, you know, the enlisted men is, we are not to question why, or, you know, but to do or die. But that's not the way people have been told what the ultimate goal is. And so regardless of the circumstances, they can work towards that.
Well, that's a good way to end, Dan, because wasn't that Sir Arthur Curry's success at Vimy was because precisely he trained and trained and trained, and everybody knew what the role was.
It was indeed. It was indeed. Yes. Good. Thank you, Julie. And Bill, thank you. On that note, if I may ask our esteemed president, Dr. Lieutenant Commander Michael Hoare, to come forward and thank you for the time you've spent with us this evening.
I think everyone can pretty much agree from that to that. You have covered a wide range of topics tonight with ease, and of course this reflective of your incredible background. We appreciate having you here for this event, and I thank you very much. I do have apparently a gift for you. It's in this bag, and I think I know what it is. And you might have one already. If you want to just kind of have a look in there.
Chemical, biological weapons.
Bill, I'm sure you all know, he is a longstanding member of RCMI. This is a new RCMI tie. You probably have one, but it has soup stains on it, doesn't it?
Yes, I would. Yes, I will wear this tie proudly because my other tie
yes,
has damage.
Your wife will be very happy. Bill, thank you on behalf of everyone here for a very good night.
Good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's good. Well done.
There's a better way to do it than
I think so.
This has been another in the series of podcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find notices of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives on our website at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the Institute, this is Eric Morse saying please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thank you for listening.